Starting the session, I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker, Mr. Park Backlund, is a professor of informatics at University of Skövde in Sweden. He has been active in the serious games community since 2005. His primary interest is in the development and application of serious games in various domains, such as education, vocational training, traffic education, and rehabilitation. Professor Pearl Backlund is also co-founder in 2008 of the Serious Games Master Program at University of Skövde, Sweden. I invite sir to kindly start this session.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be invited to an occasion like this. Yes, you already kindly introduced me, and I will say a few more words about me. As already mentioned, I work at University of Skövde in Sweden, and since 2005 I've been working with game development, and in particular serious games. But my background before that is in more traditional IT topics such as business informatics and information systems. And that is also my starting points into games and serious games in particular. I will come back to this combination throughout the presentation, I believe. We are far apart, so I thought that I'd just show you my location, my corner of the world, located in Sweden, Scandinavia, and my part is the southwest part of the country, so pretty close to our capital, Stockholm, where I work at University of Skövde. And this is a small university, but we focus much on games. And in fact, we are the biggest academic educator in computer games in Sweden. And it is, of course, also a major research area for us. We have a long track record of research and education in computer games. In fact, we started our first study programs, bachelor study programs, focusing on serious games, or rather focusing on games, already in 2002. So that leaves us with the 20th anniversary this year, which we have been celebrating during the fall now. When we talk about game development in Skövde, we actually have a very broad and inclusive view. We actually have study programs and research in all parts of game development. That is spanning technical research all the way to more artistic topics. And that also mirrors our study programs. So we have students who study game development from an artistic 2D graphic, 3D graphic animation perspective, as well as from a programming perspective. We have around 600 students in game development in total. And on advanced level, we have around 50 international students. Our advanced level study programs are in English. And I'm happy to say that we every year also have a few students coming from India. Okay, so that's a little bit about me and my background and our place. As I said, games are important at our university. But moving on then to the reason that I've been asked to give a presentation here, that is serious games. we started with this a couple of years after we had started to give bachelor education programs in games, and we saw that we needed to focus more of our attention, our research attention also towards games, since it was immediately a very successful education area. We ended up in serious games for several different reasons. But one was that at the time, serious games was the best opportunity to find funding for doing research relating to games. Since then, we have expanded. We still do serious games, but now we do other areas of game-related research as well. And especially we are focusing more and more on the entertainment games too as a topic of research. But already from the start, we took a very practical approach to our serious games research. We wanted to do design science research where we could build and evaluate solutions to what we believed were interesting and urgent practical problems that we thought could be somehow resolved with the help of games or the help of game technologies. So this is where I came in this area. As I said, my background is in more traditional information systems, so I came with the utility perspective to software. And in that area, obviously we talk a lot about IT-based systems. That's the typical type of information system that we engage in. But we focus on the utility and the organizational value of those systems. So it was not only a technological system, but it was a technological system in its context of use. And in particular, I had an early interest in bringing the human into this loop. That is, how do these technical organizational systems work for people? In what ways do they create value? In what ways do they help people doing a better job? Those kinds of issues. At the time when I moved into this area, I had experience from games as a parent and somewhat as a consumer, but not within research. But it seemed to me that the combination of utility and games, as we were talking about in serious games, would actually be quite suitable and would be a sufficient area of work and research for me, because I strongly felt that understanding those two areas and combining them would be the challenge, the big challenge of serious games. So if I think about traditional IT, if I may use that word, that utility systems, we think of it like something like this, an IT-based solution to an organizational problem. And already early on, my perception of serious games was that this was also a very strong focus, perhaps even too much of a focus towards the serious part at the expense of the game part. And ever so often, the game part consisted of using typical gamey visualizations, as that is not so much of actual game content or game feel or gameplay into the solutions. So we pretty early on geared towards that area. But I've still felt that we have a theoretical basis here. We have something important, because the only reason really to say that we want to develop and use serious games would be that we argue that we can solve a problem, and I guess solve it in a different way, or ideally in a better way than a traditional solution would do. That is by utilizing the added values of games for some purpose. So I took my starting points in the work of Professor Juhani Ivari from Finland, who together with several colleagues created something called the IS body of knowledge. This was to better understand what is IS development, what is system development. And he talks about some different distinct sub-areas of this. The domain of IS development process knowledge, that is, how do you develop those systems? The tools, the techniques, the methods that we use for system development. And this is, of course, a core competence if you're an IS developer, and it would be a core competence if you want to be a serious games developer too, because you will need to develop those kinds of systems. The domain of the IS applications, that is associated with the typical IT applications and their use in a given domain. So for example, a bookkeeping system in an economy department, I guess. And this is also classified as a core area by Professor Ivari and his colleagues. Application domain knowledge, more connected to the actual domains for which the system is built, to understand, for example, the work tasks of the people who are going to use the system would be an important task. And this is somewhat of a learning process in a development project, because it's not likely that the IS expert will know all possible application domains, so they will have to learn to understand them somehow throughout the project. And then the technology domain, that is maybe closer again to what you would expect of IS developers. That is the knowledge about the hardware and the software that is typically used and how it is applied. And then finally, the organizational knowledge would be things that we need to understand about social and economic processes overall when we develop systems for different contexts. So this is where you will have to understand other stakeholders, for example, users or managers or other people who may be involved in an ISD development process or in the use of a system. So this is all well. What do we want to do? We want to add game design to this equation to gain something. Not always certain what. But then, according to my mind, we run into the first thing to consider, that the serious game is a game. And if you look at some typical characteristics of games as presented by game scholars such as Johan Huizinga or Roger Calois, they talk about games as having other qualities. For example, these, that they should be voluntary and enjoyable. And of course, if it's a utility system that you use in your workplace, then it's perhaps not any more voluntary and not necessarily enjoyable, I guess. It should be effective and efficient. Separate from the real world and unproductive. They put a lot of effort in the idea that games are unproductive in the sense that they do not really produce any goods or anything of external value. That's another clash, I believe. But they are parts of human culture and important parts of human culture. So most people are aware of games and have played games and have some sort of relation to games, but not necessarily computer games. So with this in mind, moving into the digital area, we rather believe of computer games or video games as this. Something we do for entertainment. What we want to do is combine them. And then the question arises, what is a serious game? So if you look at these two areas, the game as a game with the philosophical view of being voluntary and enjoyable and separate from the real world, etc., and contrast that to serious games where we talk about completely other values such as effectiveness and usefulness and being productive and creating organizational value or improving business value or enhancing work or whatever. I mean, the additional purpose can be of many different kinds. Don't we end up with some sort of conflict then? And as I said, we already early on perceived that there was a high focus on the right column, the serious part, the effectiveness, usefulness, and particularly from clients. And of course, that would be the reason for them to use it. But what would be the added value, the potential added value of thinking of these solutions as games? That was, to our mind, seldom addressed. And when it was addressed by people who, like me, that were not game designers. So early on, we had the ambition to try to understand this a little bit better from the game designer perspective. So we engaged to work with game designers as well to try and gain also that knowledge. And then when we started to look at game development, we ended up with a slightly different picture, like this one, for example, contrasting to the previous picture by Professor Ivari, that you have a development team that is, of course, dependent on and understand technical development, at least if they develop computer games. They are experts in the technologies that are used, but it's also another dimension. It's not only those tech people who are relevant, it's also a whole category of new types of expertise, game design, art design, writing, audio, things that are normally not residing in neither traditional IT or, for that matter, management sciences, but rather arts and humanities. And they are still an integrated part of the development team. So much like traditional IS development, it's multidisciplinary. But I believe that the multidisciplinarity is in other dimensions when it comes to game development. And it's actually far more challenging because you also add other areas such as arts and humanities that are more about creating an experience for the user in this case being called a gamer. So yeah, in some sense, games are software products, but they are more. I mean, and in the IS community, these additional requirements are maybe typically thought of as other fuzzy requirements relating to the experience. But in fact, game design is a whole area of knowledge in itself. And it seems that in the serious games community, many scholars are not thinking too much about that. The straightforward idea to add game design to a practical solution and enhance it by increasing motivation sounds pretty straightforward, but I believe that there are many challenges to it. So how do you do this? What do these teams need to have to be able to make this marriage successful? How do you combine the utility dimension with the experiential dimension of game design? Well, we think of it as game design knowledge. And we think of it as the user is also something different. The user is also a player. So if we return to Professor Ivari's view, I believe that if you want to do serious games, and if you want to think of serious games as an utility application, as an IS application, something is missing here. And that's the game development domain that somehow also implements the new type of application that we develop, the serious game. And that has an impact on what we need the development team to look like. We need to add new type of competence to the development team. And it has some implications for how we view the users. The users are not only professionals trying to solve a problem or students aiming to learn something from an educational game. They are also, in a sense, players, meaning that we wish to somehow, by using game design components or using game design, change their way of interacting with the system or change their expectations or their feelings from interacting with the system. So that's the background foundations for us. Utility, software, games and game design, and the hopefully successful combination of these. So in the following, I thought that I'd give you a quick walkthrough of 3 of our projects that we have been working with since we started. And they represent some slightly different approaches to trying to resolve this problem. And then I will move on to analyzing them and see if I can derive some principles, things that we have learned over the last 15 years or so when we've been working with this. So the first project that I'd like to share is called Elinor. It's a project that we actually started pretty early on, already in 2007. And it was about stroke rehabilitation. We worked together with our regional neurology rehabilitation unit at our regional hospital, and together with neurology researchers who were specializing in stroke rehabilitation. The vision of the project was to create home-based stroke rehabilitation for non-typical players. That is, we wanted to design games that somehow could improve the rehabilitation effect for somewhat elderly people. So relevance, yes, we believe that this is a strongly relevant field and that it holds great potential. And of course, now we know that games for health is probably one of the biggest application areas of serious games. But stroke is a significant cause of adult disability, at least in the Western world. And in Sweden alone, with a smaller population, we are around 10 million people here only, but we still have more than 30,000 cases annually of stroke, and most of them survive. And the thing is that rehabilitation has an effect even after a long time. But the experience and the problem that the healthcare specialists came to us with was that they have observed that motivation for training drops already after a few weeks. And their belief was that better motivation in the rehabilitation process might be a solution. So we decided to get that with them to develop a game console and games to support stroke rehabilitation, or actually games that were rehabilitation games. We did this in a pretty rapid production phase. We had about 8 months total production time. That includes hardware and games and evaluation with experts. So the overall process was that we did development in the development team, and we did a pre-evaluation where we worked with nursing students, actually, because of ethical reasons. It's not very easy to get access to patients from the healthcare system, and there are also several ethical implications of working with actual patients. So we needed to reserve those for the actual tests. But we did follow this rapid loop of testing and co-design together with rehabilitation experts, where we developed different versions of games, different types of games, different versions of the actual hardware console, the device to play on, so that the requirements were continuously captured from the healthcare experts. We did some testing with reasonably healthy patients throughout the process also, but the main intervention with stroke patients was kept for the evaluation. So the development process was iterative, rapid prototype development, but the evaluation with patients was kept separate due to those practical and ethical reasons. What did we evaluate? Well, obviously we had some different interests in what we did want to develop, to evaluate. But the overall process we shared with the healthcare researchers. So we had a startup phase where we did screening tests of the participants to establish a baseline. We introduced them to the system, and we did some interviews to capture their personal views of the disease and how it could be rehabilitated. Then we had a test evaluation process of 5 weeks, where the patients had a gaming console and games delivered to their homes, and they were instructed to play for as much as they liked. And then we had weekly follow-ups at the clinic where they came to meet a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist to follow up the last week of work and training. So we thought that this aspect of evaluating the system in its natural environment, that is in the home of people, was kind of obvious. But at the time, this setup was actually pretty unique. All research that we could find on stroke rehabilitation, even where you said that you want to do it with easy, accessible games, was still done in the clinic. So we wanted to capture that additional dimension. We had 16 participants taking part in this 5-week evaluation session process. And the closure of the evaluation was that we did some follow-up tests by the rehabilitation specialists again, so that they could see what kind of results they had on their parameters, on the aspects that they measure, and then interviews again to follow up the feelings about the games and the process. So what we saw was that we wanted to evaluate gaming behavior. That was, of course, of our interest. Since we were developing games, we also wanted to see if they were actually successful as games. We measured this by playtime. So by logging the playtime of all participants, we could see that it was actually much better than we had expected. Our vision was that if we can get people to play 10 to 15 minutes per day, 5 days a week, that would be good. But when we studied our play logs, we actually saw that we had the playtime exceeding that by 5 or 6 times. So instead of roughly 1 hour playtime per week, we had an average of more than 6 hours of playtime per week. In fact, the most common complaint about the games were that there were too few games, there were too few levels, they wanted more game content. So that was a positive. We also talked to the participants and interviewed them about their play experience. And it turned out that they, even though they were very atypical gamers, most of them had no experience from playing computer games. They early on talked about their playing experience in the same way that any other player talk about their playing experience, how they lose track of time, how they lose track of other activities, and how they felt this enjoyment and meaningfulness of the activity in itself. Of course, the rehabilitation effect was important. This was measured by our colleagues, healthcare researchers, and they used standardized measures from their domain. So that is different types of tests on how everyday activities are improved. And they found significant improvements in several of those aspects. So the patients actually got to use and move their arms more. They had better measures of movement, etc., in their upper limbs. So that also seemed positive. We also evaluated acceptance, both from the patients and the healthcare professionals. We used an adapted version of the technology acceptance model, where we also looked at values pertaining to enjoyment. And again, here results were positive from both patients. They believed that, yes, this is absolutely a way to make better rehabilitation. And the healthcare professionals also felt that this was a reasonable way of working. The system solved several of their problems, in particular the motivation problems, but it still yield good rehabilitation results. So the main takeaways from this case is that we ended up in a mid-range system, we believe, which was kind of new at the time. Existing stroke rehabilitation systems were high-end systems, typically to be used in the clinic. There was a lot of talk at the time about using any commercial off-the-shelf game for rehabilitation. Nintendo Wii was launched around this time. And many, of course, saw the potential of the Nintendo Wii system with its physical interaction, that it could be a great tool in rehabilitation. But what we saw early on was that all games, even the most accessible and easy to play games, were far too hard for the segment of players that we were targeting, people with a cognitive and physical disability. So that would be the first case, stroke rehabilitation with a specific game console, the Eleanor console, that would be used in the home to use games that were specifically designed for the rehabilitation task. The second case is also in the healthcare sector, but it's very different. It's about ambulance training or pre-hospital medicine training. We did this together with the regional ambulance unit at our regional hospital, and we worked together with pre-hospital researchers this time. The application was medical simulation and training. And this is traditionally done with very advanced mannequins, so full-size mannequins that simulate several physical parameters of the human body. But they are used then for the training, again, for ethical and practical reasons. It's much better to train on a simulated system than on real humans, of course. The goal was to develop a new way of doing this kind of medical training simulation so that it was closer to the pre-hospital context. So what does that mean? Well, obviously, medical care is at the core also in pre-hospital context. But the challenge with pre-hospital medicine is that it's much more messy, much more unforeseeable with respect to which contexts it can occur in, and what kind of situations you end up in. It's totally unknown. For at the time of the alarm, when the ambulance is dispatched, they may have very limited or even no information of the situation that they will meet and experience. And of course, they know, for example, if they're going for a traffic accident, that there's some contextual information there, but the work can be in any type of context, and that's a challenge that is not captured in traditional medical simulation training, and that is what we wanted to capture. How to include the context of the medical treatment better into the training process so that you could capture also that complexity of the pre-hospital intervention. So for us as game researchers, we wanted to explore how immersion affects the use of serious game. The concept of immersion is commonly used in the game development community, and it refers to the feeling of being really involved in the playing experience, defined as the subjective impression that one is participating in a comprehensive, realistic experience. And building on the work of Janet and her colleagues, we wanted to transfer this into the domain of pre-hospital training. The way we thought when we wanted to represent more of the contextual complexity into the medical, pre-hospital medical treatment was contextualization. So traditional medical simulator training can take care in any place, like the left column here, where you don't really take the context of the treatment into account at all. For example, the instructor will just say, you just arrived at the scene of an accident. You're in the apartment, you have a middle-aged man suffering from some unknown condition. And then they do their medical examination. Let's see. I saw a chat message. Sorry for the interruption. But what we wanted to introduce here by the concept of contextualization was that we wanted to add to the simulation not only the medical part that was with the mannequin, but also what do these ambulance nurses pick up from the general context. For example, if you can simulate the environment in which they arrive, then, for example, if you end up in an apartment with a man with an unknown medical condition, and from the context you can see that there are some cans of pills available, you can maybe deduct that, okay, this may be some sort of drug-related incident. And then additionally, initially, you have more information for your decision-making. So that makes the medical treatment different. And if we can capture that in the training process, that would be beneficial to the training. Then, of course, a lot of the training takes place, or the treatment takes place in the ambulance during transport. And that's another totally different work context, which also traditionally was not taken into account. So we tried to, by contextualization, to capture more of those specifics of the pre-hospital process when it comes to the medical treatment, when it comes to the communication and how you have to interact with patients as well as other people on the scene of the accident, and the transport. So by doing that, we believe that we made a more sufficient type of medical simulation training to the pre-hospital nurses rather than the traditional one. So the takeaways from this project was that we developed a novel way of doing medical simulation training for pre-hospital context. And we used the concept of immersion and tried to apply it to build better training simulation for pre-hospital medicine. And we could also actually show in our field experiments at the ambulance unit that we had higher immersion participants were better engaged in the contextualized versions of the medical scenarios that we developed. And in the follow-up study, we could also, by evaluation of pre-hospital experts, and that is other than those that we worked with, so independent pre-hospital experts evaluated the performance of the teams, and they could also see that the decision-making was better in the contextualized versions of the scenarios that we provided. So it seems that the contextualized scenarios were actually better for the purpose of pre-hospital medical training. The third project is called Hidden in the Park, and it's about risk awareness of internet and social media, where kids are active from early ages. And it was together with a foundation that works against child abuse on internet, and the World Childhood Foundation. And the goal with this project was to address a sensitive topic with the help of a game, and that is grooming online. So sexual perpetrators trying to attract kids for malicious purposes. So online grooming is an increasing societal problem globally. And it occurs in lower and lower ages because younger and younger kids are online. And it's very hard to address and inform about this in target groups as young as 7 years. So how do you address that in a game? Well, what we came to was not at all. So instead, we developed a game called Hidden in the Zoo or Hidden in the Park for 4 players, where the players should hide a treasure of coins. And then the game is about finding each other's treasures with the help of different clues. So each player has 4 clues, and it's the combination of these 4 clues that will reveal where your treasure is hidden. The game is played, it's a board game in combination with augmented reality and a tablet. The tablet is used for several different things in the game. So it's used to tell the players what to do. It's used when the players should hide their treasure. It's used when the players should guess where the other players' treasures are hidden. And it's also used to roll the die. The winner, well, that's the person who first finds someone else's treasure. So with the tablet, you will also play different mini games. Those mini games, there are kind of rewards for doing well in the game also. So you want to do well in the game so that you can, for example, buy mini games with more gold coins. But then something happens. Through the tablet, the player will get messages from an unknown actor. And these messages will try to lure the kids into sharing where they have hidden their treasure. So, for example, in the beginning, it's very friendly and innocent. So this unknown player will ask, if you show me one of your clues, then you will have an extra minigame, for example. But then it turns into other things, into promises, into bribes, and even into threats to reveal where the hidden treasure is. This is at the core of the idea, because the way that this unknown operates is based on real chat logs from sexual perpetrators online. So this unknown uses the same strategies that are commonly used in the grooming process. And the idea to capture that in this way is by means of procedural rhetoric. So game scholar Ian Bogost coined the term procedural rhetoric to describe the procedurality that is in games, that when you interact with games, the interaction has some effects on the procedure. It bears some meaning, and you can learn something from that. So what we mimic is actually the patterns of those grooming processes. And then that is a basis for the learning in a discussion with teachers. So after playing the game, the kids will still just have played a fun game. But when the teachers talk to them, they can talk about how do you behave when you are on social media? What should you think of? Well, you should, for example, think of never to answer questions about yourself to unknown people. Those kinds of things that are captured in the procedurality, in the procedure of the game. So the main takeaway that the game worked well for the target group. The combination of board game and augmented reality was actually much appreciated. There were some challenges with this procedurality, the idea that the mechanic is the message, that it can actually be quite hard. It's not always apparent how to interpret those interactions and what is actually the procedure. And it may require some level of game literacy to actually understand this or think of this. But we learned that the debriefing with teachers can actually remedy that, because the kids understand and they can draw some conclusions in the discussions with the teachers. We saw that the augmented reality sort of worked as a wow factor, especially in the mini games. They were perceived as kind of fun and cool. But of course, the wow factor is a double-edged sword. I mean, things move really quickly in digital games. So what's a wow factor today will probably not be next week. So that's, of course, something to keep in mind. So that's the third project. Now, if we then look at the model that we have thought about, me and my colleague Henrik Engström, where we think of a design space for serious games, we have the two dimensions, utility and gameplay experience. And maybe there could be an optimal serious game that is high on both dimensions. But if we look at our cases and plot them into this design space, we can see that the Sarek project was not actually very gamey, and not much focus on the gameplay experience, and not much what you would think of traditional gamey content, although it was some sort of a role-playing game. Of course, it's live role-playing in a sense, but it was actually very high on utility. So it solved a very practical problem for the ambulance training unit, and they could actually redesign their training procedures to capture some additional aspects. Hidden in the Park, well, very high on gameplay experience. It was perceived as a very fun and engaging game, but the utility was harder because it required a lot of intervention from teachers. So a lot of what was not classified as utility within the game had to be compensated in the context. And actually this is, we believe, quite a good strategy, because it can relieve much of the design work of the game if you can think of developing a context for the game that can also add to the utility value. So then you could move upwards on the utility dimension by providing good playing contexts. Eleanor project sort of maybe hit the middle here. The games were perceived as fun and engaging. We had that from both play experience and play time. Utility was also perceived as good by the measurements of the parameters that occupational therapists and physiotherapists use to measure success of rehabilitation. So in that sense, those three different projects can illustrate three different approaches, we believe, to think of serious games or to think of serious game design. So to summarize, we have derived 7 design principles for serious games. Game design experience is crucial. You really need to include skilled game designers in the design process when you develop serious games. Games are not typical IS applications or typical utility applications and cannot be understood as such. You can think of both the gameplay experience and utility dimension of serious games by this design space that we derived. The wow factor, we love to think about it, but it's a double-edged sword, and maybe you don't really always need to put so much invention into the game design, because there are many very good solutions already from the game design community. You need to talk to the clients also about the game dimension, because typically that is not within their skill. Their skill will be in the application domain. We believe that this is a distinct domain if you want to do successful serious games. And we believe that when you choose to introduce concept ideas from the game design domain into the IS domain, there are some challenges, because you will have different theoretical underpinnings and different goals. So here are some pointers to most of the material that I have used. The main message is to be found in this 4th article, Engström and Backlund, Serious Games Design Knowledge, from 2021, available in the EAI endorsed transactions on serious games. So that one is available online. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. I realized that I maybe used a few minutes too much. Apologies for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I now invite panel members and the participants to please ask their questions. You may write your question in the question and answer tab also.
Yeah, I saw there is here something.
You have so many questions, I think.
Okay. So,
Vinod sir, please. Sir, you on mute.
I have one question, I think, in the chat. I will just take a minute to read it. Yeah, so the question is about using other games as serious games. So the games that I talked about, they were specifically designed to be serious games. And this question is about, what about using any game as a serious game? And that is actually quite an important and big stream of research about that. So there are several papers you can find that is about how can you use an entertainment game, for example, as a serious game in some situation. So it happens, and it's also being researched. I will try to come up with an example, illustrating example. So for example, I have read several articles about using games such as SimCity and similar city simulators to teach social sciences and economics, to teach something about how society is organized, maybe to understand basic economics. And I think that, of course, an entertainment game, it was not designed to provide this utility value. So then, to my mind, you will end up in the part of our design space where you will have to create a context to use it. So, for example, if you want to use that SimCity-like game to teach something about city building and economy, you would probably have to design a lot of teaching material around the topic to discuss with the students, to explain what happens, because of course what's in the game is like an abstraction of a system, and a very simplified one, and it does not necessarily capture exactly what it is that you want to teach. So yes, I think it happens a lot, and I think it has huge potential when it's used consciously. But I also think that it puts a lot of it becomes very important for the user to create the context, the play context, to create the utility.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
thank you, sir. One of the question is from a participant who's a student and working on gamification and ideation techniques. So is there any suggestion regarding this?
Gamification versus serious games. So we haven't very much framed ourselves as working with gamification. We noticed that whereas serious games is maybe an early concept, I think that the first mentioning of the term serious games is probably by Clark Abt in his book in 1970. And my interpretation is that we talk about games that is trying to capture something, for example, trying to teach something. Whereas gamification, I mean, by definition, when people talk about gamification, they say that it is the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. So I guess that you break down games and think about, okay, what are the different components of a game? Well, those game mechanics, they can be, for example, collecting things or shooting things or collecting badges or leveling, those kinds of components. And I think it's something different, but not entirely different. I surely think they are siblings. So I think that gamification, being a slightly younger discipline in that sense, the first mentioning I think of gamification was maybe around 2008, 2009, at least in academia. So I strongly believe that gamification can learn a lot from the serious games community, because serious games has been researched for a longer time. I also think that the gamification community can gain much from understanding game design on a deeper level to become even better of trying to utilize whatever game design components they want to. Because otherwise, I think there is a risk that gamification very easily ends up with very crude applications of scoreboards and badges, which is maybe not super motivating in the long run. I think that is a huge risk. So maybe by understanding games and game design better, gamification can find more interesting and innovative ways of using the game design elements.
Okay, is there any other question from panel members? Please, Ramesh sir, please ask.
Professor Buckland, I noted that there was one instance of that AR game, augmented reality. I wanted to understand that what are the requirements. I know that there is a software part, but other than that, in terms of creating the AR experience, what are the skills needed and what are the prerequisites? Means, do we need some designer? Then there is one content person who will think of that. If as a layman, someone wants to create an AR game, then what should we have with us?
Yeah, when we did that, we had in the team, apart from us researchers, a game designer, a trained game designer with a lot of game design experience, but also at that time a PhD student, and a research engineer. So we had both the game design side and the technical side well covered. The challenge was that the AR components were sort of not at the core of the game. And we didn't really come up with a way of making them a core of the game in that sense. I mean, well, because the mini games, they were totally depending on the AR functionality to do cool things. But at the core loop of the game, which is to hide and find the treasures, then we also used the AR, because the tablet was used to both hide your treasure and to guess where your co-players' treasures were hidden. So we managed to get it somehow into the core game loop too. But I think that the risk was that the AR component was sort of just an add-on to provide something cool. And I think that was a big risk. It's not, I mean, in some instances, for example, in Pokemon Go, maybe the AR component is really the thing about the game. It's at the core of the game. I think that we partially reached that. No other comparisons at all with Pokemon Go, obviously.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I think we have covered all the questions in the session. And I would like to thank Professor Parv Backlund. It was really an interesting topic to learn serious game design and simulation. I now invite Dr. Jigyasu Dubey, Coordinator of Center of Excellence in Simulation and Gaming, to propose the words of thanks.
Thank you, Rupali ma'am. On behalf of Center of Excellence in Simulation and Gaming, COESG and Sri Vaishnav Vidyapith Vishwavidyalaya, Indore, India, would like to give our most sincere thanks to Professor Parv Backlund. So we are thankful for your wonderful presentation on serious games, and also thankful for accepting our invitation and giving your precious time out of your busy schedule. Thank you very much, sir. Our special thanks to our panel members, Mr. Haman, Ms. Bose, Dr. Ramesh Sharma ji, Dr. Vinod Damblekar ji, and all other panelists who are present, and all the participants who make this webinar successful. I am thankful to our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Upinder Dhar, for mentoring COESG, and I'm also thankful to Professor Rupali Bhartiya, all the members of COESG and IT team of the university for their kind support. The next webinar is scheduled on 3rd December 2022, which is the 13th webinar of this series. So thank you to all of you and hope to see you all on 3rd December. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and I'll proceed with lunch here, actually.
Thank you so much, sir. And I request all the participants to please fill the feedback form as mentioned in the chat box for getting e-certificate. Thank you, all of you. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.